Welcome back to the Everyday Saint. I'm Eve Rosemary, Catholic communicator, and this week we are at the National Shrine of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. We are currently in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and I'm so excited to bring you on this tour because it's not just about the Catholic faith, but it's also the history and foundation of the great, nation of America. So excited to bring you. Let's go.
We are going to begin embarking back in time to the first of the properties that Elizabeth Ann Seton would have inhabited while arriving here in Emmitsburg. This particular building actually dates back 30 years prior to Elizabeth's arrival. And what you'll see before you definitely looks a lot more cozy, I will say, than it would have during Elizabeth's time. I'm sure you've noticed there will be a large portion of loss we touch on during this story. But what's remarkable about Elizabeth and arguably this legacy is not specifically about the loss. It's in fact more so what was done as a result of this loss. The determination and quite frankly the sheer faith that it would have taken around these losses to achieve what was achieved here. Elizabeth was born in 1774 to a rather affluent family in New York. Her father was a very well-to-do doctor, very well-renowned. Due to this fact, he was actually abroad quite a bit during her childhood, which wouldn't have been an issue, except unfortunately, by the time Elizabeth was 2, her mother actually passed away during the childbirth of her youngest sister. And unfortunately, again, by the time she was 4, that youngest sister unfortunately would also pass away. There is a bit of intrigue in Elizabeth's youth. So her father technically was a member of the Church of England, what would later become the Episcopalian faith. But he was not a particularly devout religious man. What's interesting is well before Elizabeth is introduced to the concept of Catholicism, she has this call. She was known to have gone to as many churches in New York and the New Rochelle area as possible on Sunday to get communion as many times as she could. Little did she know that later on in life she would be introduced to the Eucharist, which I think largely was what drew her to the Catholic faith. This sort of physical proximity to the Father. And that being said, there's much more tragedy before we get to that point. But there is a bit of a happy addendum between now and then. She falls in love at the age of 19 to the son of a very well-to-do merchant. The two of them quickly married. They ended up having 5 children together in their home on Wall Street. I mentioned that William McGee Seton is the son of a very well-to-do merchant. Not he himself is a very well-to-do merchant. That being said, unfortunately, William McGee Seton Sr., his father, passes away. This creates, unfortunately, a bit of a trickle effect. And within months of the company sort of being under William McGee Seton's control, unfortunately, that company would go bankrupt. The Setons would not be the same again. They lost everything. This is notable as well because the stress of this situation, unfortunately, kind of led to William himself becoming ill. Their theory is that if he, his wife, and their eldest daughter, Anna Maria, were to sail to Italy, perhaps the change of air, the much cleaner Mediterranean air, might inspire healing. They do sail to Italy, but unfortunately, at the same time in Italy, there is a yellow fever epidemic going on. So, unfortunately, when William comes very symptomatic, they mistake his symptoms of that of yellow fever. So he is actually quarantined for about 30 days, and unfortunately, he would pass away there. So to give you a bit of a recap, Elizabeth is 4'10". She is 29 at this point in her life. She is now the widow of essentially 5 children, in addition to the fact that she would also become responsible for William Seton's younger sisters that now essentially had no one left to care for them. Because while she is in Italy, the Felici family gives her a moment's rest after the death of her husband to sort of take a moment and grieve. But during this time in Italy, she is introduced to the Catholic faith. Back here in the United States, the only sort of Catholic presence that existed at the time was in Baltimore, and that Catholic presence was not necessarily accepted here. So this would have been her first real introduction to Mass, to, quite frankly, the art, the architecture, the literature, but most of all, what appealed to her was the Eucharist. She doesn't decide immediately she's going to think about this. She's going to weigh her options. So she ends up coming back to New York, but knowing that Elizabeth is debating this conversion, the family that was meant to support her and her children withdrew that support. So it's not all lost. Elizabeth had the luxury of having a very wealthy father who prioritized her education. She spoke French, she was very well read. She had an opportunity to teach. She would be great at it. But Because again, word had spread, she tried to teach in New York, and nobody wanted their children to attend her school for fear that they would be converted. So, back to the Faliki family. They, and I'll mention this a few times in this story, the people that met Elizabeth in the moment seem to have been changed. It's very easy to look back at someone 200 years ago and measure their accolades of that of a saint. It's much less common in my anthropological career that I find people in the moment, more so than Elizabeth herself, are acknowledging that she's meant for something very, very great. Specifically the Faliki family, with their brief interaction with her, had such faith that they actually corresponded to the only archbishop in this country, Bishop John Carroll in Baltimore, that they had someone that was going to matter. So, with her less than accepting time in New York, she actually decides, you know what, I'm gonna try. And she goes to Baltimore. And they actually are successful. They open a very small school. There's only about 12 girls that attend, and you can still visit that school in Baltimore on Packard Street today. And it only lasted about a year, but it was enough for not only the sort of Catholic powers that be, but Elizabeth herself to realize not only was she meant to be a mother, she was meant to be a teacher. So, flash forward geographically, in 1808, Mount St. Mary's, the seminary, the boys' school about 2 miles from here, was erected. So the thought was, if we're going to attempt to spread Catholicism, if we're going to move west, why not theorize perhaps having the first free Catholic girls' school? And why wouldn't we then have it in tangent with the boys' school? So this hasn't been done yet in history, and quite frankly, we're going to need someone to oversee this operation. They were going to need a Mother Superior. This is where Elizabeth comes in. At the same time in history, a gentleman who is from Emmitsburg, his name was Samuel Cooper, he decided he wanted to become a priest. He wanted to join the seminary. Enter Elizabeth. 270 acres, and the small house you see in front of you here were all that sat on this property back in 1809 when this was purchased for Elizabeth by Samuel Cooper. Everything you see from this line over was added after Elizabeth's lifetime, so everything from here over. This is what Elizabeth and 17 others would live in from August of 1809 until February 1810. This was brutal. I like to mention as well, these are young New York and Baltimore city girls. This was going to be a bit different. That being said, please follow me into the room quite literally where the Order for Sisters of Charity was born. This central room here would have been, honestly, the main living area. You'll notice that there are but 3 rooms on this first portion, including this sort of central area, but then you have our chapel and what was originally intended to be Mother Seton, her sleeping quarters. But in this story you will find, very rarely does Mother Seton take up sleeping where she's meant to. Typically she gives it away to whomever is ill, and unfortunately there is almost always someone that is ill. This was farmland, this was rural. This house had been abandoned for 30 years prior. It was in very bad condition, and they had no idea if this was going to work. What's notable is everyone that started here, with the exception of Harriet, made it up. Even upon being bit by fleas, these affluent ladies, not one left. I think that's a very distinguishable point. Even now, I know very devout young Catholic women that upon the first flea bite would have been like, I'm gonna go back to New York. Good luck with what you're doing. And that's not what happened here. Again, more sort of evidence of just how influential Elizabeth's presence was. This is actually the regulations of the order that was formed in this room. This is what the Sisters of Charity were founded upon. Originally, Daughters of Charity, founded by St. Vincent de Paul and St. Louis de Marillac in France, were intended to come and sort of oversee this operation. But because of sort of international conflicts at the time, Napoleon would not release Daughters of Charity here. So, Sisters of Charity are modeled very, very closely after the charisms that Daughters of Charity are modeled after, but with a bit more of a devotion to education, as you might guess. What's also interesting is Elizabeth Ann Seton was a mother. She had children that she refused to relinquish in order to do this. So she was actually granted permission for her 3 daughters to attend with her, as well as her 2 sons attended the seminary, and she was able to keep her family together, which, if we kind of look over the course of her life, this was kind of saving her. Even if it didn't work, this was the best option to have. There is something to be said about being able to walk on the grounds that arguably held the happiest and the saddest moments of a saint's life. So it's Also, this is the longest place she stayed settled for her entire life. It is where her life ended, but it's also, honestly, kind of the longest home. This is Elizabeth Ann Seton's classroom. The doors to this school would have opened in February 1810. Within days, what's called day students would have begun to arrive. Up until this point, if you wanted your daughter to receive a good Catholic education, you would likely have to send her abroad. So this offered a good education in addition to a safe harbor for young ladies that quite frankly would not have had an opportunity otherwise. Most of the children that lived in town would have only known how to read and write if their parents did, which frankly would have been unlikely. What's amazing though is not only did the children of Emmitsburg attend here, but children as far north as New York, as far south as the Carolinas, and as far west as Louisiana began to come and live here. In addition to those boarders, those day students, she would actually also go and retrieve orphans from orphanage asylums, Philadelphia, New York, wherever, bring them here, assign them a sister that quite frankly acted as a mother. And these children referred to her as mother, not Mother Superior. I think that's about as telling as you can get. She didn't want to be called Mother Superior. She didn't want to be superior. You'll notice these original certificates of achievement here on the mantle. These are hand painted in watercolor by Sisters of Charity, often given to children who show advancement, determination, virtues. It wasn't necessarily an academic boast, it was what was in your heart. I don't know how familiar you are with education system in early America. This is a very positive reinforcement environment compared to many institutions I've researched, and it's, again, it would be one thing if there was like one biased record that recorded all of this as being such a loving environment, but it's not. It's every student, the sisters who lived here, everyone recalled this as a safe place, a home. These next two rooms are the most important to me, and everyone sort of has their own take on what sets a room apart. This is the chapel designed for students and sisters to attend Mass daily. This is also the room that holds the most original objects. For instance, that altar is original, designed by Mother Seton. The intention of that shape you see protruding a bit is to remind you that not only was Christ brought to us cradled in a manger, but blood, body, soul, divinity, still present in the Eucharist, is also cradled in that manger, that we are never essentially put down from the love of God. This corner here there is actually where Elizabeth Ann Seton used to kneel to receive communion, as well as most of her very fervent prayers would occur in this spot. So two of the pieces that mean the most to me in this room are actually these very simple portraits of Christ and Mother Mary, but it's because, if you remember, she was not born Catholic, and her father wasn't even a devoutly Christian man. So I don't understand why these portraits were gifts from him on her 16th birthday. And if you recall, she went bankrupt during her marriage. She lost everything. Wasn't Catholic, but somehow had a devotion enough to Mother Mary to save these portraits, long enough that she displayed them in her school. I think that's divine foreshadowing. What's also interesting is her sort of catchphrase to her students was always, look up. Do not look down upon the worldly things that will only bring you down. Look up at what awaits you. So it's interesting to note that all of the portraits in this house are also looking up. This is the room that Elizabeth Ann Seton would go on to pass away in, but there's much to cover prior to that. Filiki Calvary carving. If you remember, the Filiki family is quite literally credited with introducing Elizabeth to the Catholic faith. Up until last year, that piece hung in this place instead of our St. Joseph portrait for over 200 years. I want you to sort of keep that in mind. So imagining that there, and if we look on this back wall, we see the engraving of our Redeemer, which again, notice it's looking up. But what's also amazing is this was a gift from her husband on their wedding day, well prior to her conversion. And if you look closely at what Jesus has before him, it's again almost divine foreshadowing for what would appeal most, what would essentially call her home to him, is that present of the Eucharist. And you'll notice that Calvary carving above the mantle. What's depicted in that image is a bed about here, more accurately than in the corner. You'll see Catherine Seton, Elizabeth's only surviving daughter, mourning at the fireplace. You'll see Mother Seton herself next to her daughter's bed. In the bed, unfortunately, you'll see her youngest daughter, Rebecca Seton, with a crutch lying against the bed. Earlier, I pointed out a cistern that we passed. That was the location that her youngest daughter, Rebecca Seton, slipped and fell, cracked her hip. But she didn't tell anybody. Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Anna Maria, prior to this image being depicted, also fell ill with tuberculosis in the same spot, in the same bed, and actually went on to pass away. So Anna Maria Seton was Elizabeth's eldest, the one that accompanied her to Italy, essentially was her first baby. She passed away at the age of 18, hands clasped in prayer. They made her an honorary Sister of Charity prior to her death. And because of this, Rebecca fell during that time and didn't want to take attention away from her very, very ill sister, so she kept it quiet. And unfortunately, tuberculosis set into her hip and spread to all of her bones. And it was brutal, to say the least. But up until this point, Elizabeth is not a stranger to brutality. She's seen so many people die, but she hasn't lost babies her own. Having suffered through everything she suffered through, thinking that you've actually built the safe haven that not only your own daughters, but everyone's daughters that were here needed, and then to lose yours. Lots of loss is covered in this story, but it's more so about how she responded to the loss that sets it apart. So after she lost two of her daughters, she herself finally began to succumb to tuberculosis. It's not her death I'd like to focus on, it's how she prepared for it. So imagining that Calvary piece still where it was meant to be above that fireplace, and this portrait of the Redeemer there, quite frankly, sandwiched between her Heavenly Father. Boy, assuming Mother Seton's head's here, she's got eyes on Christ. Look what else she had her eyes on. Her last words on January 4th, 1821 were, "Be children of the church, be children of the church." And this speaks to the fact that she meant those words. Her last sights could have quite frankly been the altar. This room is essentially the central living area. This is where young ladies are working on needlework. This is where laughter, tears, emotion, this is the center of life, and this is where she chose to take her last breaths. A mother through and through. What's also interesting is actually right out this door, I'll show you the window that would have been her view. But this window here has always had her desk. So out the window, she could still see the cemetery because she said she wanted to be able to see her little darlings. We have reflections of her burying her youngest daughter and seeing the coffin of her eldest in the ground next to the grave she was currently digging and essentially falling apart. So you'll be able to stand in that spot. In addition to that, two graves down is Harriet Seton, that first burial that began what would go on to be this very, very large legacy. And to be able to stand there after you've heard the story, you've seen the objects, you've gotten the information from, our amazing, Elisa's fantastic, and you've got to compile sort of the story element, and then you arrive here, and this is where you realize, yes, wonderful story, influential, but this was life. This mattered. This was their full scope. They didn't know what was going to happen 200 years later. This was an act of faith. And I like to think that what we have here now, well over 200 years later, is a testament of what can happen when you respond to an act of faith. Cecilia Seton, her sister, was up here for 2 months, and then she passed away. So we have 4 Setons in a row that held so much weight. Specifically, we have Rebecca Seton and Nina Seton, Anna Maria. This is where Mother Seton reflects about burying her youngest and seeing the side of the coffin while burying her youngest of her eldest. This spot here is actually the original resting spot of Elizabeth Ann Seton. This is not the original marker. The original marker would have been something more akin to like a wooden cross. Her son, William, actually didn't realize that she had passed away. He came to visit and was sort of intercepted with the information. He was not thrilled with the condition that her burial was. So it took 20 years, but he actually elected to have this built. So he is the reason that this mortuary chapel stands. Elizabeth was laid to rest there for quite some time. Now who is in there is actually descendants of hers, including a Roosevelt who went on to become an archbishop. But she was then moved after the construction of St. Joseph's College and Chapel. She was moved to the chapel over there for quite some time. And then finally, in 1975, upon completion of the basilica, she was actually entombed there.
With this background on St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, especially at the mention of her tomb, we're going to head into the actual shrine church, which is filled with mosaics, and learn a little bit more from the shrine about this church. Let's go.
The basilica itself was made for the Daughters of Charity. It was to be their mother house. It was started in 1960 and was completed in 65. There's only one painting which we can walk towards, which is actually in the dome. Everything else is 7 different kinds of marble, and the entire altar is mosaics. Yeah, so all of the saints that are up above are all connected to the Daughters of Charity in some way, and then the lower stained glass are all different names of Mary. So Mother Seton is buried under there. You can see in that photo what her casket looks like. She was only 4'10", but every time they moved her, I think they put her in a smaller casket. And that is her bone there on the altar. So this is the Holy Agony Chapel. You can see the different kinds of marble that make up the whole basilica, and then you can get kind of a really close look at the mosaics. These all arrived here like in individual boxes, so you can see why it might have taken a long time to create the images that they did.
Thank you so much for watching this week's episode of the Everyday Saint Shrine Tour. You can also learn more about the shrine on the Everyday Saint podcast as we sit down with them to hear a little bit more about more reflections when it comes to the life of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. Thank you so much.